The Gormenghast Trilogy by Mervyn Peake. Book 1. Titus Groan. Blood at Midnight. Tonight, the atmosphere was alive. A kind of life made even more palpable by the torpor of the air, the ghastly summer air of Gormenghast. By day, the heat of the dead light. By darkness, the vomitings of the sick room. There was no escaping. The season had come down. As Mr. Flay waited, his shoulder blades against the stone pillars, his thoughts flowed back to the day of the christening when he had slashed at the great soft face, to the night when he had watched the rehearsal of his murder, to that horrible sack that had been he, to the day of the debauchery of the great kitchens, to the horrors of the hooting Earl, to 100 memories of his tormentor, whose face in his imagination opened out before him in the darkness like something septic. His ears were strained with listening, and his muscles ached. He had not moved for over an hour, save to turn his head upon his neck. And then, suddenly, what was it that had changed? He had shut his eyes for a moment, and on opening them the air had altered. Was the heat even more horrible? His torn shirt was stuck to his shoulders and belly. It was more than that. It was that the darkness was omnipresent. The quadrangle was as inky as the shadows in which he had been shrouded. Clouds had moved over the moon. Not even the bright sword in his hand could be seen as he moved it out into what had been moonlight. And then it came, a light more brilliant than the sun's, a light like razors. It not only showed in the least minutiae the anatomy of masonry, pillars and towers, trees, grass blades and pebbles. It conjured these things. It constructed them from nothing. They were not there before. Only the void, the abactinal absences of all things. And then a creation reigned in a blinding and ghastly glory as a torrent of electric fire coursed across heaven. To Flay it seemed an eternity of nakedness, but the hot black eyelid of the entire sky closed down again, and the stifling atmosphere rocked uncontrollably to such a yell of thunder as lifted the hairs on his neck. From the belly of a mammoth it broke and regurgitated, dying finally with a long-drawn growl of spleen. And then the enormous midnight gave up all control, opening out her cumulus body from horizon to horizon, so that the air became solid with so great a weight of falling water that Flay could hear the limbs of trees breaking through a roar of foam. There was no longer any necessity for Flay, shielded from the rain by the roof of the cloisters, to hold his body in so cramped a manner. What little sound he made would be inaudible now that the falling rain hissed and drummed, beat across the massive back of Gormenghast and swarmed down its sides, bubbling and spurting in every cranny of stone, and swilling every niche where had lain for so long the white dust. Even more so now he had to listen for the sound of approaching paces, and it is doubtful whether he would have been able to disengage the sound of the chef's feet from the drumming background. What he had never expected happened, and his heart broke into an erratic hammering, for the impalpable darkness to his left was disturbed by a faint light. And immediately after, the source of this hazy aura moved through the midnight. It was a strip of vertical light that appeared to float on end of its own volition. The invisible bearer of the octagonal lantern had closed all but one of the shutters. As Flay edged his fingers more firmly along the butt of his sword, the glow of the lantern came abreast of him, and a moment later had passed, and at this same moment, against the pale yellow glow, could be distinguished the silhouette of Swelter's upper volume. It was quite simple. It curved up and over in one black dome. There seemed to be no head. It must have been thrust down and forward, an attitude that might have been imagined impossible in one whose rolls of lard-coloured fat filled in the space between the chin and the clavicles. When Flay judged the silhouette a good 12 paces distant, he began to follow, and then there began the first of the episodes, that of the stalk. If ever man stalked man, Flay stalked Swelter. It is to be doubted whether, when compared to the angular motions of Mr. Flay, any man on earth could claim to stalk at all. He would have to do it with another word. The very length and shape of his limbs and joints, the very formation of his head and hands and feet, were constructed as though for this process alone. Quite unconscious of the stick insect action which his frame was undergoing, he followed the creeping dome. For Mr. Swelter was himself, at all events in his own opinion, on the tail of his victim. The tail did not happen to be where he supposed it, 2 floors above, but he was moving with all possible stealth nevertheless. At the top of the first flight he would place his lantern carefully by the wall, for it was then that the candles began, and continued at roughly equal distances to cast their pale circles of light from niches in the walls. He began to climb. If Mr. Flay stalked, Mr. Swelter insinuated. He insinuated himself through space. His body encroached, sleuth-like, from air volume to air volume, entering, filling and edging out of each in turn, the slow and vile belly preceding the horribly deliberate and potentially nimble progress of his fallen arches. Flay could not see Swelter's feet, only the silhouetted dome, but by the way it ascended, he could tell that the chef was moving one step at a time, his right foot always preceding his left, which he brought to the side of its dance-like companion. He went up in slow, silent jerks in the way of children, invalids, or obese women. Flay waited until he had rounded the curve of the stairs and was on the first landing before he followed, taking 5 stone steps at a time. On reaching the top of the first flight, he moved his head around the corner of the wall, and he no longer saw the silhouette of his enemy. He saw the whole thing glowing by the light of 2 candles. The passageway was narrow at this point, broadening about 40 to 50 feet further down the corridor to the dimensions of a hall, whence the second flight led up to Lord Sepulchre's corridor. Swelter was standing quite still, but his arms were moving, and he appeared to be talking to someone. It was difficult for Flay to see exactly what he was doing until, a moment after he had heard the voice saying, "And I'll make you red and wet, my pretty thing." He saw the dim bulk half turn with difficulty in the constricted space of the passageway, and he caught the gleam of steel, and a moment later a portion of the shaft and the entire murderous head of the double-handed cleaver. Mr. Swelter was nursing it in his arms as though he was suckling it. "Oh, so red and wet," came the moss-soft voice again. "And then we'll wipe you dry with a nice, clean handkerchief. Would you like a silk one, my pretty? Would you? Before we polish you and tuck you up, What? No answer? But you know what Papa's saying, don't you now? Of course you do. After all that he has taught you. And why? Because you're such a quick, sharp baby. Oh, such a sharp baby." And then Mr. Flay was forced to hear the most disgusting sound, as of some kind of low animal with gastric trouble. Mr. Swelter was laughing. Flay, with a fair knowledge of low life, was nevertheless unable to withhold himself, and kneeling down quickly upon the great pads at his knees, he was silently sick. Wiping the sweat from his brow as he rose to his feet, he peered again about the angle of wall and saw that Swelter had reached the foot of the second staircase where the corridor widened. The sound of the rain, though less intense, was perpetually there. In the very sound of it, though distant, could be felt an unnatural weight. It was as though the castle were but the size of a skull, over which a cistern of water was being rapidly emptied. Already the depressions and valley-like hollows in the castle grounds were filled with dark lakes that mounted momently, doubling and trebling their areas as their creeping edges met. The terrain was awash. A closer degree of intimacy had been established in the castle between whatever stood, lay, knelt, was propped, shelved, hidden, or exposed, or left ready for use, animate or inanimate, within the castle walls. A kind of unwilling knowledge of the nearness of one thing to another, of one human to another, though great walls might divide them, of nearness to a clock or a banister, or a pillar or a book or a sleeve. For Flay, the horrible nearness to himself, to his own shoulder and hand. The outpouring of a continent of sky had incarcerated and given a weird hyperreality of closeness to those who were shielded from all but the sound of the storm. Lying awake, for none could hope to sleep, there was not one in all the dark and rattling place who had not cogitated, if only for a moment, on the fact that the entire castle was awake also. In every bed there lay, with his or her lids apart, a figure. They saw each other. The consciousness of each other's solid and individual presences had not only been engendered by the imprisoning downpour, but by the general atmosphere of suspicion that had been mounting. A suspicion of they knew not exactly what. Only that something was changing. Changing in a world where change was crime. It was lucky for Flay that what he had relied on, the uncommunicative character of the Countess, held true, for she had not mentioned his banishment to a soul, although its cause still smarted in her prodigious bosom. Hence Swelter's ignorance of the fact that, as he made his first few porridge-like paces along Lord Sepulchre's ill-lit corridor, he was approaching a flayless darkness, for immediately before the door there was impenetrable shadow. A high window on the left had been blown in, and glass lay scattered, and at the stairhead glittered faintly by the light of a candle. Mr. Flay, in spite of the almost unbearable tension, experienced a twinge of ironic pleasure when, having mounted the second flight, he watched the rear of his enemy wavering into the darkness in search of his own stalker. There was a shallow alcove across the passageway from the top of the stairs, and with 2 strides Mr. Flay had reached it. From there he could watch the darkness to his left. It was purposeless to follow his enemy to the door of his master's room. He would wait for his return. How would the chef be able to aim his blow in the darkness? He would prod forward with the cleaver until it touched the panels of the door. He would take a soft pace backwards. Then, as he raised the great instrument above his head, a worm, wriggling its bliss through his brain, would bring the double-handed cleaver down like a guillotine. The great blade whetted to a screaming edge. And as this picture of Mr. Swelter's methods illumined the inside of Mr. Flay's darkened skull, those very movements were proceeding. Concurrently with Flay's visualization of the cleaver falling, the cleaver fell. The floorboards beneath Mr. Flay's feet lifted, and a wooden ripple ran from one end of the passageway to the other, where it broke upon a cliff of plaster. Curiously enough, it was only through the movement of the boards beneath his feet that Mr. Flay knew that the chef had struck. for at the same moment a peal of thunder killed all other sound. Swelter had brought the cold edge downwards with such a concentration of relish that the excruciating sense of consummation had dulled his wits for a moment, and it was only when he attempted to work the steel away from what gripped its edge that he realized that something was amiss. It is true that he had expected the blade to slide through the prostrate beneath him as through butter for all the thin man's osseous character, but not surely with such ease, such liquid ease. Could it be that he had given to the double-handed cleaver such an edge as set up a new sensation, that of killing, as it were, without knowing it, as lazes through long grass the lethal scythe? He had not prodded forward with his toe to make doubly sure, for it had never occurred to him that he who had lain there night after night for over 12 years could be elsewhere. In any event, he might have weakened the long scrag by so doing. What had gone wrong? The orgasmic moment he had so long awaited was over. The cleaver was difficult to shift. Perhaps it was caught among the ribs. He began to run his hands down the shaft, inch by inch, bending his knees and trunk as he did so, hot tracts of hairless clay redistributing their undulations the while. Inexorably downwards moved his fingers until they itched for contact with the corpse. Surely his hands must by now be almost at the boards themselves, yet he knew how deceptive the sense of distances can be when darkness is complete. And then he came upon the steel. Sliding his palms greedily along either edge, he gave a sudden, loud, murderous hiss, and losing his fingers from the edge of the cleaver, he swung his bulk about as though his foe were close behind him, and he peered back along the passage at the faint light at the stairhead. There seemed to be no one there, and after a few moments of scrutiny, he wiped his hands across his thighs and, turning to the cleaver, wrenched it from the boards. For a short while he stood, fingering his misused weapon, and during this space Mr. Flay had conceived and acted, moving a few yards further down the corridor where an even more favourable ambush presented itself in the shape of a sagging tapestry. As he moved out into the darkness, for he was beyond the orbit of the candle's influence, the lightning struck again and flared bluishly through the broken window, so that at one and the same moment both Swelter and Flay caught sight of one another. The bluish light had flattened them out like cardboard figures, which had, in the case of the chef, an extraordinary effect. Someone with an unpleasant mind had cut him out of an enormous area of electric blue paper the size of a sheet. For the few moments that the lightning lasted, his fingers and thumbs were like bright blue sausages clasped about the cleaver's handle. Flay, presenting no less the illusion of having no bulk, struck not so much a sense of horror into Mr. Swelter as a fresh surge of malice. That he should have dulled the exquisite edge of his cleaver upon flayless boards, and that he who should now be lying in two pieces was standing there in one, standing there insolently in a kind of stage lighting as a tangible criticism of his error, affecting him to the extreme of control, and a horrid sweat broke from his pores. No sooner had they seen one another than the darkness closed again. It was as though the curtain had come down on the first act. All was altered. Stealth was no longer enough. Cunning was paramount, and their wits were under test. Both had felt that theirs was the initiative and the power to surprise, but now, for a few moments at least, they were equated. Flay had, from the beginning, planned to draw the chef from Lord Sebelcrave's doorway and passage, and if possible to lure him to the story above, where, interspaced with wooden supports, for the roof was rotten, and with many a fallen beam, mouldered the Hall of Spiders, at whose far end a window lay open to a great area of roof, terraced with stone and turreted about its sheer edges. It had occurred to him that if he were to snatch the candle from the stairhead, he might lure his enemy there, and as the darkness fell, he was about to put this idea into operation when the door of Lord Sebelcrave's bedroom opened, and the Earl, with a lamp in his hand, moved out into the corridor. He moved as though floating. A long cloak reaching to his ankles gave no hint of legs beneath it. Turning his head neither to left nor right, he moved like the symbol of sorrow. Swelter, flattening himself as much as he was able against the wall, could see that his lordship was asleep. For a moment Mr. Flay had the advantage of seeing both the Earl and the chef without being seen himself. Where was his master going? Swelter was for a few moments at a loss to know what to do, and by that time the Earl was almost abreast of Mr. Flay. Here was an opportunity of drawing the chef after him without the fear of being overtaken or slashed at from behind, and Flay, stepping in front of the Earl, began to precede him down the passage, walking backwards all the while so that he could see the chef over his lordship's shoulder as the dim figure followed. Mr. Flay was well aware that his own head would be lit by the Earl's lamp, whereas Swelter's would be in semi-darkness, but there was no great advantage to the chef in that, for the creature could not get at him for fear of waking the Earl of Gormenghast. As Flay receded, step by step, he could not, though he tried to, keep his eyes continually upon the great cook. The proximity of his lordship's lamp-lit face left him no option but to turn his eyes to it, rapidly from time to time. The round, open eyes were glazed. At the corners of the mouth there was a little blood, and the skin was deadly white. Meanwhile, Swelter had narrowed the distance between the Earl and himself. Flay and the chef were staring at one another over their master's shoulder. The three of them seemed to be moving as one piece. Individually so much at variance they were, collectively so compact. Darting an eye over his shoulder, as though without reference to the head that held it, Flay could see that he was within a few feet of the stairway, and the procession began the slow ascent of the third flight. The leader, his body facing down the stairs the while, kept his left hand on the iron banister. In his right the sword glimmered, for, as with all the stairways of Gormenghast, there were candles burning at every landing. As Flay reached the last step, he saw that the Earl had stopped, and that inevitably the great volume of snail flesh had come to a halt behind him. It was so gentle that it seemed as though a voice were evolving from the half-light, a voice of unutterable mournfulness. The lamp in the shadowy hand was failing for lack of oil. The eyes stared through Mr. Flay and through the dark wall beyond, and on, through a world of endless rain.
"Goodbye," said the voice. "It is all one. Why break the heart that never beat from love? We do not know, sweet girl. The arras hangs. It is so far away, dark daughter. Ah, no, not that long shelf. Not that long shelf. It is his life work that the fires are eating. All's one. Goodbye, goodbye."
The Earl climbed a further step upwards. His eyes had become more circular.
"But they will take me in. Their home is cold, but they will take me in. And it may be their tower is lined with love, each flint a cold blue stanza of delight, each feather terrible, quills, ink, and flax, each talon glory."
His accents were infinitely melancholy as he whispered,
"Blood, blood, and blood, and blood for you, the muffled all for you, and I am on my way with broken branches. She was not mine, her hair as red as ferns. She was not mine. Mice, mice, the towers crumble. Flames are swarmers. There is no swarmer like the nimble flame, and all is over. Goodbye, goodbye, it is all one. Forever, ice and fever. Oh, weariest lover, it will not come again. Be quiet. Now, hush then, and do your will. The moon is always, and you will find them at the mouths of warrens. Great wings shall come, great silent, silent wings. Goodbye, all's one, all's one, all's one!
He was now on the landing, and for a moment Mr. Flay imagined he was about to move across the corridor to a room opposite, where a door was swinging. But he turned to the left. It would have been possible, indeed it would have been easier and more to Flay's advantage, to have turned about and sped to the Hall of Spiders, for Lord Sepulchrave, floating like a slow dream, barred Swelter's way. But at the very idea Mr. Flay recoiled. To leave his sleeping master with a prowling chef at his shoulder horrified him, and he continued his fantastic retreat as before. They were about halfway to the Hall of Spiders when, to both Flay's and Swelter's surprise, the Earl moved off to the left down a narrow archery of midnight stone. He was immediately lost, for the defile wound to the left after the first few paces and the guttering of the lamp was quenched. His disappearance had been so sudden and unexpected that neither party was prepared to leap into the vacuum left between them and to strike out in the faint light. It was in this region that the grey scrubbers slept, and some distance down there was suspended from the ceiling a broken chandelier. Towards this light Mr. Flay suddenly turned and ran, while Swelter, whose frustrated bloodlust was ripe as a persimmon, thinking the thin man to have panicked, pursued him with horribly nimble steps for all the archless suction of his soles. Covering the flagstones with a raking stride, Mr. Flay was for all his speed little more than 9 feet in advance of Swelter as he broke his way into the Hall of Spiders.